It began not with noise, but with a quiet hum. Typewriters tapping in dimly lit rooms, saxophones weeping softly under street lamps, and verses whispered across cafe tables in the heart of Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just a cultural movement, it was a slow unfolding dream. A time when poetry, jazz, and paintbrushes tried to stitch something hopeful into the weary fabric of a post-war world. Tonight, we won't rush through revolutions or shout about jazz. We'll drift gently through the sleepy alleys of 1920s Harlem, where history sighed instead of screamed. If you love falling asleep to the soft rhythms of forgotten history, hit that subscribe button, tap like, and ring the bell icon so you never miss another sleepy tale. From Langston Hughes to rent parties with poetry and pie, this is your quiet front row seat to a revolution made of words and whispers. You step onto a Harlem sidewalk in late winter, when the wind runs at street level like an impatient courier. It feels ordinary and slightly inconvenient, the way most of history actually lives, in schedules, deliveries, and the small negotiations of neighbors. If you look up, the brownstone row houses stack into a rhythm, stoops rising to parlor floors, narrow windows, cornices scalloped with grime. The buildings aren't famous, but they taught thousands of newcomers how to live in a city that was not made with them in mind. A person arriving from Savannah or Norfolk or Charleston might have expected to find a miracle on these streets. Instead, they found a block captain, a landlord with a ledger, and a stove that needed coal. The first lesson of Harlem was not music or poetry. It was rent, heat, groceries, light, and time. The story begins before the applause. At the turn of the 20th century, this neighborhood was in motion long before its reputation caught up. Developers had built speculative row houses for middle-class white families when rapid transit promised a northern exodus from crowded downtown districts. But the market soured, residents shifted, and vacancies crept like ivy room by room. In that gap, brief, financial, almost invisible, came a different kind of migration. Black families moving uptown, not as a cultural movement yet, but as tenants looking for the best available deal. The practicalities of this move were mundane and profound. A household surveyed the city by cost per room, by distance to work, by how long a child could reasonably walk to school in winter. They weighed the quiet of a north-facing room against the thinness of a wall, the burden of a dumbwaiter that stuck 2 floors below, the kindness or indifference of a superintendent who controlled the boiler. Coal deliveries marked the rhythm of winter. A chute door on the sidewalk clicked open, and the driver would shoulder the empty sacks back to the truck. Inside, the bins filled, and someone, usually a tenant, sometimes a janitor, shoveled a measured number of scoops into the furnace, listening for the change in the fire's voice, a subtle rushing that told you the radiators upstairs would soon begin to tick and breathe. The very sound of heat threaded through Harlem's rooms, a hiss at ear level in a narrow hallway, the metallic pinging that woke a child before dawn. Anyone who has slept in a century-old apartment knows that radiators are teachers of patience. You cannot rush them, you cannot plead for their favor. They reward routine, open the bleed valve when the pipes gurgle, keep the path clear around the vents, and you will have enough warmth to dress for school without bracing. The kitchens were working rooms as serious as any factory floor. Iceboxes sat on their little pedestals, keeping the cold by melting, the blocks slowly shrinking day by day. You learned the habits of spoilage, how long a piece of salt pork could sit, how quickly greens wilted after a long walk home from the grocer. The iceman was a regular figure, strong-backed with his tongs and leather apron, climbing stoops with a practiced ease. The sound of the ice sliding into place, short, heavy, exact, meant dinner could be held over another day if need be. On Sundays, a pot might sit at a gentle simmer for hours, stretching flavor into thrift. The pantry, if there was one, held a quiet grammar of survival, jars, tins, sacks, a careful surplus against wages that could stop without notice. Daily work defined the neighborhood more than any stage ever could. Men left early for jobs as porters, laborers, and drivers. Some wore the uniform of a sleeping car company, the shine on their shoes as much a requirement as the politeness they had to carry like another piece of luggage. Women were the shock absorbers of time, laundresses, seamstresses, cleaners, or cooks. Many took in boarders, converting a parlor into a rented room with a bed neatly made, a pitcher and bowl on a small stand, and a set of rules about noise and visitors agreed upon in quiet, practical conversations. The money from a boarder might cover coal in January or shoes for a child in March. These arrangements weren't romantic. They were a ledger, with rooms and meals as line items, reviewed not with sentiment, but with a clear-eyed understanding of what the month demanded. The sidewalks were schools too. A boy learned to step down and off when a wagon wheel squeaked too close, to look for the place where the curb dipped and froze first after sleet. A girl learned which stores carried credit and which would not, which clerks would open a ledger with the promise of next Thursday, and which would only say, "sorry," with a practiced shrug. The voices on the block traced one of Harlem's defining features, a blend of Southern and West Indian speech, a meeting of rhythms and recipes, hymns and proverbs. It was not always harmonious. There were arguments about whose style of worship was proper, whose curt manner felt like a slight, and who could claim to understand the city better. But at the corner, where everyone ended up eventually, waiting for bread, for a streetcar, for a friend, they shared the day's weather and news, as neighbors do everywhere. Churches stitched the neighborhood together in a pattern that made sense, even if the plan was unwritten. On one block, a congregation gathered inside a sanctuary that had once belonged to another denomination, the old stained glass letters still faintly visible if you looked from the right angle. On another, a storefront church warmed up on Saturday night, benches set out, a small organ tuned as best as the player could manage, the doorway left open to let passers-by hear what they might join. Sunday service was a dress rehearsal for Monday's burdens. The sermons traveled from pew to kitchen table, rephrased into advice about how to speak to a landlord or a teacher, where to seek help for a brother who had come home sour from losing a job. The church basement hosted suppers and clubs. A women's society might keep a care chest, soap, sheets, a sturdy comb, for families moving uptown with little more than their clothes. Charity here was a steady stream, not a flood, a casserole carried up 3 flights, a half-day's wage pressed into a palm with a look that said, "Just pay it forward when you can." At the core of this ordinary life stood the school. Even in cramped classrooms, even with drafty windows and overworked teachers, families insisted on neat collars and quiet attention. Night schools were as common in conversation as corner groceries. A porter took typing after his shift, trying to open a door to clerical work. A domestic worker attended bookkeeping 2 evenings a week, learning to keep the lists that ran other people's businesses so she could someday manage her own. The teachers were practical saints, measuring out lessons with a careful eye for fatigue. They knew a student who nodded off after an 8-hour shift needed both correction and mercy. They also knew small victories mattered. Spelling a word right in front of the whole class without fear, balancing a column of numbers correctly a second time, daring to ask a question. The rooms where the famous names would someday visit were at this point simply living rooms. A piano, a luxury, and a tool sat in the corner, and a child learned scales by counting out loud. Sheet music stood like a second language on a stand, softened by use, and neighbors came to listen on weekends when work permitted. The early parties were less about glamour and more about arithmetic. A rent party meant what it said: cover the shortfall with music and a plate of food, one evening at a time. The invitations moved through whispers and chalk marks on stoops. The rules were straightforward. Bring 50 cents, behave yourself, and remember that someone needs to sleep before work tomorrow. This is where a local style forms, not by declaration but by practice, By the way bodies arrange themselves in a too small space, by the sequence of songs that keep people from leaving, by the thought that tomorrow's rent sits in the toe of a shoe under the bed. Grocers and butchers were steady, unremarked historians of the street. They saw who switched from cuts of beef to more beans by mid-month, who kept buying oranges for a sick child out of stubborn hope, who could be trusted with a tab that would be settled on payday. They were also gatekeepers of etiquette. A boy who forgot to say good morning might find his change placed on the counter with deliberate slowness until he remembered. A woman who kept a clean ledger and paid on time gained a reputation that smoothed things elsewhere. The basic economy of trust moderated the harder market of cash, and in a city where formal institutions too often kept doors shut, these informal arrangements made an outsized difference. Transit routes governed ambition. A person traced opportunity by track and timetable. The simplest dreams, more pay, a shorter commute, a job that didn't wreck your back, became ratios measured against train schedules. A transfer might add 12 minutes, but open a route to a factory that hired without the sideways look. Strong legs and good shoes were job skills, even if no employer ever wrote them on a form. Standing on a platform in the early evening, a worker looked up at the sparks thrown off in a burst and thought not about music or poetry, but about whether there would be hot water when they got home. Only later would the same routine train someone to move through the city with a set of timings that made late-night gatherings possible. Only later would that endurance become part of the atmosphere of culture. There were rules that stung without being written. You learned which restaurants served you at the counter and which slid your plate with a shrug that was half warning. You learned to keep receipts, to write your name clearly, to produce documents when asked, as if paperwork could make a path through how the world truly operated. Many people treated the city as a puzzle they could solve with dignified persistence. They collected addresses of good employers, cheap doctors, friendly teachers, and neighbors who would check in on a child for an hour if both parents were called into overtime. The day-by-day work of living demanded an index in the mind nearly as detailed as any formal directory. And this, quietly, inexorably, knitted a community thick enough to withstand shocks. Some shocks were loud. The rumor of a fight could transform a block's mood by mid-afternoon. A night of police attention sank into Monday's whisper network, who to avoid, which corner to cross from the opposite side, where not to be after 9. But the greater drama unfolded at a slower pace, in numbers charted by the city. Rising rents, more people per room, more buildings with rooms for let. Landlords adjusted, some with opportunism, some with fairness, most with a mixture of both depending on the week. Tenants adapted in kind, negotiating an extra month before an increase or haggling for a small repair as part of a handshake deal. The city's housing laws changed rarely and slowly. The real law was the arithmetic conducted around kitchen tables with dull pencils worn to a nub. The library on the avenue, with its thick wooden tables and careful silence, became a second home for many. The habit formed: finish a shift, stop at a reading room, copy out 2 pages of something you needed to master. Examine the classifieds with a ruler to keep your place in the lines. There is a kind of courage in sitting still and returning to words after the day has stolen your attention. The stacks reflected diasporas of experience, primers and etiquette guides, novels and sermons, cookbooks and geography texts. An older woman might show a teenager how to find the card, catalogue entry, and act as solid and useful as handing over a loaf of bread. Domestic details, the kind that rarely make headlines, governed the tempo of evenings. Laundry days turned kitchens into steam baths. Rope lines strung across rooms made the air damp with soap. Irons were heavy, rhythms steady. Sweeping a stoop in the morning was not just tidy habit, but social code. You showed respect for the street and asked for some in return. Boys played stickball in the late light. learning how a ball rebounded off a brownstone wall compared to a fence post. The sound of a violin practicing somewhere upstairs slipped down the stairwell, and nobody clapped because that was not the point. The point was that practice itself was a kind of survival. It is tempting in retelling a famous period to skip ahead to the glamour, the names you recognize, the stages, the covers of magazines. But it is a mistake to think the culture appeared fully formed. The material of daily life, the spoon in the cup, the hand on the banister, the habit of counting change twice, made the art possible. You could not stay out late listening to a band unless your aunt watched the baby and your neighbor promised to keep an ear open. You could not spend an evening reading in a borrowed book if your boarder did not agree to wash the dishes that night. A city block is a negotiation, hour by hour, and what we later call a renaissance can only occur when ordinary people have arranged enough stability to permit the extraordinary to appear without threatening the roof overhead. Meanwhile, outside voices were gathering, organizers passing handbills, preachers trimming their sermons to match the tenor of the times, editors marking up proofs by lamplight, and shopkeepers deciding whether to set a sign in the window endorsing one cause or another. These were not theatrics, they were daily choices that collectively bent the neighborhood toward a weather system of ideas. By the time the first famous poem referenced a particular corner or ballroom, that place had already been sanctified by years of people sweeping, arguing, gossiping, napping, learning, and holding one another up when luck failed. A block becomes itself long before it becomes a symbol. At day's end, the stairwell smelled like meals, soap, and wool. A tenant paused on a landing to adjust a bundle, listening to the muffled hymn from the apartment below. On the top step, someone set down a bucket with care. Downstairs, a door clicked shut in a way that meant peace, not warning. It was neither glamorous nor tragic. It was the sound of ordinary endurance. You might stand there a moment, not to eavesdrop, but to measure your breath against the building's steady exhale and think about tomorrow's list. And if you knew then what the world would later say about these blocks, that they birthed a renaissance, you might smile at the mismatch, because anyone who lived through it would tell you the foundation was not brilliant evenings so much as consistent mornings. Nobody wrote a manifesto on a radiator lid, but that is where many decisions got made. The limits of paychecks and weather determined attendance at meetings as much as conviction did. A mother declared that her daughter would attend a reading circle because the evening chores could be shifted. A lodger agreed to mind the stove so the couple could hear a speaker on 7th Avenue. These choices were small and cumulative. They linked kitchen tables to pulpits and meeting halls, and later to what people came to know as the Harlem Renaissance. The word Renaissance would have sounded too fancy at first. People said, "We're pushing through, we're getting along, we're making it." They were, in a practical sense, building the scaffolding of a cultural world without naming the structure. What you hear if you close your eyes in an average apartment in the late evening are the sounds that built the thing: the stiff brush against a Sunday coat, the pencil scratch of a child doing arithmetic, the choked chuckle of an old man telling a worn-out joke, the tiny clink of a spoon in a teacup, the shudder of a train far underground, the sigh as someone settles into a chair to read one more page. In the morning, they will do it all again. And a traveler from another time would recognize this as the true creative act. Repetition, guided by hope. If the question is where the Renaissance began, the better answer may be here, in repetition itself, in the insistence on orderly days as a precondition for extraordinary nights. But if all this took place behind closed doors and on ordinary sidewalks, how did the pulse of private routines become the public voice that the world would one day call a renaissance? In the dim margins of early morning, long before the day's first deliveries rattled along 7th Avenue, The schedules of distant railroads already shaped Harlem's rooms. The Great Migration was not a single wave but a recurring tide, measured in trunks and parcels, in letters that preceded families by weeks, and in knowledge passed from one set of hands to another. If you stood in a rented parlor and kept still, you could feel the city's pulse quicken every time a distant whistle blew south of the island or out beyond the marshes of Jersey. What the newspapers later called movement was, for those involved, a matter of tickets, transfers, and tips. You did not uproot a life in one motion. You broke it into pieces you could carry: a sewing machine, a family Bible, a box of photographs, bound with string, a frying pan with the right weight in the hand. Arrival did not announce itself with horns. It announced itself with the sound a key makes the first time it slides into the lock of a new door. In that quiet, practical space between departure and belonging, Harlem began to cohere into a network. You met your landlord, you noted which stores extended credit, and you introduced yourself at the nearest church. You learned the name of the block's unofficial organizer, the woman with the never-failing pot of coffee who knew where one more cot could be fit, the man who could put a word in with a mechanic or a porter line. You added your name to the list for the next meeting at the lodge hall, where talk would be plain and centered on needs: coal, childcare, the question of whether to accept a small rent increase or threaten to move. It felt like administration because it was. But out of these ordinary sessions grew the appetite for something more than mere survival, the idea that if a street could be arranged, perhaps a neighborhood could be represented. The first times that Harlem spoke with one voice were not in theaters or on radio, but in church basements where placards were painted by hand, and in apartment kitchens where mothers pressed collars and adjusted hats for a march down a grand avenue miles to the south. You picture it: a silent procession, children holding signs in letters big enough to read from a stoop, men and women in their Sunday best, walking not with spectacle, but with purpose. The quiet was not absence, but method, a restraint chosen to focus attention rather than inflame it. The march began in words spoken from pulpits and living rooms, set down in flyers distributed one door at a time. In that deliberate silence, you could hear the mechanics of a neighborhood at work: watch committees, ushers, the woman who wrangled a sewing circle into making sashes, the elder who insisted on a particular order of march. When it ended, what lingered back on 135th Street and 137th Street was the memory of moving together, of truly occupying a public space as more than just isolated tenants. At the same time, other processions threaded the avenues closer to home, turning the blocks into a calendar of uniforms and standards. You saw bands and banners, a pageantry of brass buttons and epaulets, the discipline of a drill team. Some parades were strictly local, benevolent societies celebrating anniversaries with their members in sashes and gloves, broom-wielding clubwomen marching with tidy pride. Others belonged to movements that stirred fierce loyalties and equally fierce debates, mass meetings with speakers promising a new set of horizons, an emphasis on ships and trade and return, a black star sewn in cloth that caught the light differently depending on which way you stood. Some neighbors cheered, others argued over coffee. Most lived in the useful ambiguity of agreeing on dignity while disagreeing on method. Either way, the regularity of parades put the habit of discipline into the eyes of young people watching from stoops, and the sound of drums taught them a cadence that later appeared in dance steps and stage entrances. If the marches were headlines, the footnotes were in ledgers and stockrooms. Shops along Lenox and 7th Avenue adapted to the traffic of newcomers. A hatter learned the preferred brim widths of men from coastal towns. A dressmaker recognized fabrics favored by women from islands further south. Spice mixtures adjusted. Bakeries added items that tasted like home to someone who had spent days on a train. On weekday afternoons, a shopkeeper stood at the door with a pencil behind the ear and scanned the street the way a farmer reads the weather. In his arithmetic, Streetcars were winds, school let out was a change in pressure, payday gusts arrived like summer squalls. He stocked accordingly, and a neighborhood's palette made the cash register ring in new patterns. You could read migration by inventory and delivery routes. If you cared to pay attention to the cartons on the sidewalk, the smell of citrus after a fruit truck pulled away, the line that formed reliably in front of a bakery just after the afternoon trains arrived at the station downtown. Information moved by hand and voice. The sleeping car lines stitched cities together at night, and the men who worked those cars carried more than shoe polish and stories. They moved newspapers and ideas, folded into valises with starch collars and extra laces. A commuter who had never been south of the Battery could nevertheless have a conversation about job openings in Philadelphia or a bricklayer's wages in Pittsburgh because of the quiet exchange that connected terminals to tenement steps. After supper, neighbors gathered in hallways to share what had been heard. A new factory rumored to be hiring, a landlord rumored to be selling, a cousin's letter that named a city worth trying if New York proved too hard. None of this was dramatic. It was the careful, incremental adjustment of lives to opportunities and disappointments. Yet it fostered a sense that the neighborhood could be navigated by shared information, and that sense laid a foundation for cultural life. A poem cannot be distributed, a concert cannot be well attended, if the channels of awareness are broken. Inside lodges and union halls, the most consequential work of the decade took shape on folding chairs around tables that wobbled. A man practiced a speech in a whisper, adjusting the phrasing to suit the crowd he expected. A woman counted the tickets twice and then by tens to be sure. It takes repetition to build an institution, and many of Harlem's institutions were held together with repetition as strong as glue. Sponsoring a debate meant arranging chairs, appointing ushers, and sending a boy down the block to fetch the extra water jug. It meant setting a start time and honoring it, even if the most important people arrived late. The atmosphere you imagine as glamorous was, in origin, a ceremony of punctuality and cleanup. Behind nearly every photographed event, there was someone sweeping up confetti, someone checking the window latches, someone folding tablecloths and stacking them in a cupboard to be used next month. The world of entertainment developed out of this same infrastructure of regularity. The halls that hosted church fairs on Saturdays and union meetings on Tuesdays could be coaxed into ballrooms by Friday night. A stage, if it had one, was modest. If it did not, performers stood on a platform that had seen more sermons than songs. But a good drummer can make any room feel bigger. The first orchestras did their own setup and carried their own stands. Sheet music was copied by hand. Set lists were trial and error, refined by noting when feet stopped moving. A manager took mental notes about timing, when to start, when to ease, how to keep the crowd on the floor long enough to cover the cost of the hall. Nobody called it strategy. They called it making the numbers work. Some clubs advertised widely, others worked by rumor. The most famous venues came later, but smaller rooms laid the track. A ballroom on 138th Street taught the neighborhood how to arrive in good time, how to queue without fuss, how to part politely for couples leaving early, to relieve a neighbor babysitting upstairs. A theater on 132nd presented variety shows that were earnest and occasionally awkward. The best performers made their names by smoothing rough transitions between acts and by knowing how to rescue a room when the preceding performer had lost it. This wasn't glamour. It was craft, learned measure by measure. When people later spoke of a sound belonging to Harlem, they were naming the accumulation of such nights where a saxophone learned the echo of a particular ceiling and a singer learned how to ride the soft swell of applause from a balcony above. Benevolent societies filled financial gaps that banks left. On Monday nights, a treasurer ticked down a list of dues paid. The fund helped with funerals, with a week's groceries after a layoff, with a doctor's visit. There were also in the interstices less formal systems that stood in for credit. A woman who ran a small handbag of numbers in her kitchen also ran a ledger that kept lights on for neighbors who were between wages. The neighborhood understood the cost and weighed it against the alternatives, which often were none. Such economies are often spoken of with euphemism or condemnation by those who never had to keep the heat on by ingenuity, but on the blocks themselves they were evaluated by function. If the fund could pay for a boy's appendix to be taken out in time, the argument did not reach for phrases like moral hazard. It reached for a casserole dish and a visit with fresh sheets. The library settled into its role as a crossroads of quiet ambition. A clerk with ink-stained fingers learned to recognize the regulars, the man who favored newspapers, the seamstress who checked out a new novel every third Friday, the teenage girl who worked her way through a shelf of poetry, copying lines into a notebook and underlining words that felt like the city in winter. Upstairs, a reading room sometimes hosted lectures. Sometimes it simply provided a table where strangers shared the company of pages. If you asked around, you would hear that certain visiting writers had sat at those tables, but the more important truth was that thousands of residents sat there too, thinking their own small, clear thoughts. Culture flowers where concentration is respected and, more importantly, where concentration is possible, where the rent is paid, the kettle can boil, and the radio is turned down for an hour by a father who remembers what it is to chase a sentence in your head until it lands. You can trace the emergence of Harlem's public voice in the meeting notes of block associations. Early entries concern snow removal and lamp repair. Later, they mention a reading circle, a debate over whether to invite a lecturer, a decision to sponsor a youth music night. The incremental widening of scope is almost invisible in any single month's notes, but obvious across a few years. It is not that the practical concerns vanished, they never do. It is that a neighborhood discovered it could hold the practical and the aspirational at once, and that doing so strengthened both. A child walking home from a violin practice above a grocery store might start to believe that a block could protect beauty as surely as it protected a stoop from litter. By the time outsiders began to say the word Renaissance, the people inside the neighborhood had long since established a larger habit: to show up. Show up for the meeting, for the reading, for the drummer who needed bodies on the floor, for the neighbor who needed a babysitter for 2 hours. Showing up built a timetable of confidence. When a magazine announced a reading at a certain hour, people came because they trusted that the door would open at 7 and not at 8:15, and that the lights would be good enough to see a page and that the chairs would be there. No art grows without such dull assurances. The promise of the extraordinary rides on the back of the reliable. It can be easy, especially in retrospective accounts, to narrate this as a frictionless rise toward triumph. It was not. It was a sequence of obstacles, each solved temporarily, then reappearing in another guise. A new landlord, stricter with increases. A job lost and replaced with one farther away. A city that welcomed labor but remained reluctant to welcome equality. Yet the very repetition of these problems trained a neighborhood to cope, and that coping produced the capacity to support institutions beyond survival. When the orchestra played a new tune in a rented hall, you were hearing the resilience of coal shovels and night schools distilled into sound. When a poem was read aloud, you were hearing the hum of a sewing machine in the stanza's steadiness. The timetabled walk to work in the measured line breaks. If you collect these routines, the block meetings, the marches, the lodge gatherings, the library hours, the dances, you sense a turning. Private discipline slowly becomes public confidence, and public confidence becomes a sound that can be recognized even by people who have never set foot on these blocks. The question is not why this happened, but how precisely the transfer occurred. At what point did a corner's pattern of life become material that could travel as poetry and song? And who first understood that the quiet logistics of a neighborhood could serve as the engine room for an artistic statement the world would hear? You do not need a grand opening to change a city. Sometimes all it takes is a well-timed rehearsal and a room that holds its sound. By the mid-1920s, Harlem's spare rooms had produced more than rent parties. They had produced musicians who knew how to move an audience in cramped conditions, how to make a piano talk over the clatter of dishes, and how to adjust tempo to keep a landlord's evening solvent. Those skills translated easily into ballrooms. The floors had sprung wood, and the ceiling seemed to hold a soft pocket of air that let brass instruments bloom without turning harsh. You stood at the edge, and the entrance of the first horn line told you that the neighborhood had acquired a confidence that was neither borrowed nor begged. It had been built from scratch in kitchens and basements, one rehearsal at a time. The ballrooms were democratic in an old-fashioned way. You didn't need to be important to get in. You needed to know how to behave once there. People dressed carefully not because fashion magazines decreed it, but because clothing was the grammar of respect, the respect for the band's effort, for the floor's collective movement, for the neighbor whose rent you had helped cover last week and who now wanted to forget the arithmetic of coal for 3 hours. Dancing in such a place taught you to listen as much as to move, to give way to the couple next to you, to anticipate a band's break, to catch the rhythm that arrived half a beat earlier than you expected because the drummer knew this crowd. The famous names, some of which would travel far, had their roots planted in this semi-public classroom, where taste was calibrated by feet on wood and applause moderated by the need to catch a breath and a sip of water before the next number. On other nights, theatres hosted variety shows that were a study in steady craft. A comedian saved a lagging act by stepping forward a minute early. A singer adjusted the key because the house piano was tuned a shade flat. A stage manager with a clipboard made sure the next curtain rose to the right mark. And a girl in the chorus practiced a step backstage, counting under her breath even as she smiled out front. It was not rarefied art. It was paid work, done to a standard that the neighborhood increasingly demanded. People remembered the nights when everything clicked and told the story later, shaving off the roughness. But if you had been there, you would remember the smell of dust when the curtain rose, the slight thunk when a mic stand settled, the small stretch that a saxophonist used to coax embouchure back after a taxing solo. These were the minor efforts that sustained the major impression. Magazines and newspapers began to describe the neighborhood in language that insisted on a newness, a blossoming. Meanwhile, editors who lived among the people they wrote about adjusted proof in small apartments, setting type late and checking lists twice. They understood that the best way to honor the work was to get names right, to spell with care, to report the time a reading would begin, and then make sure it did. The literary world took shape not in dreamy freedom, but in routines. Submissions read after supper, drafts revised at kitchen tables that had just been cleared of plates, a letter posted on the way to work. A young poet read her lines aloud into a mirror to practice an unobtrusive confidence. A young novelist sketched his blocks on a piece of scrap paper to keep his scenes honest. Honesty mattered to an audience that knew the difference between a stage set and a real corner. Patrons and salons added a layer of support and expectation. A certain parlor became a site where people gathered not only to be seen, but to test ideas in a conversation that could switch from talk of canvases and keys to talk of rent and school overcrowding without losing its thread. A hostess who knew the cost of coal and the price of paint arranged evenings that drew artists and workers into the same room with coffee and a plate of cookies. On the table sat magazines that announced contests, and on the wall hung a calendar where deadlines were circled. The myth of easy discovery evaporates when you see how these rooms functioned as calendars and filing systems, as bulletin boards and morale boosters. A painter made a list of frames needed. A sculptor noted where to buy plaster cheaper. A composer asked who had a spare hour for copying parts. This is how a scene stays solvent long enough to become a movement. Teachers and librarians, often overlooked in the glamour, provided the patient correction that art requires. A librarian quietly guided a young researcher toward a collection of pamphlets that would give the next poem its texture. A teacher suggested reading a sonnet aloud until the line breaks felt like breath rather than arithmetic. At evening lectures, the audience included men who had come straight from shifts, hands still rough from tools, and women who had cleaned other people's houses all day and now wanted to hear a sentence that did not ask them to lower their eyes. The attention in those rooms was intense and calm. The air of study that had settled over the neighborhood in earlier years now gathered weight, as if the collective insistence on learning had found its voice, and the voice was neither pleading nor strident. It was confident the way a block is confident when it has already shoveled. It stoops before the sun hits the ice. The collision of working life and artistic life produced a texture that the world recognized as distinctly of this place. Songs took their shapes from train timetables, poems carried the cadences of sermons and storefront bargaining, paintings borrowed the geometry of stoops and cornices, dance steps absorbed the logic of line waiting and the release of a payday. When an orchestra lifted off in one of the larger halls, listeners felt a familiarity. The energy was their own daily energy, transformed by craft into something they could recognize and celebrate outside the grind that had produced it. A neighborhood hears itself for the first time in such moments and realizes that the phrase other people are using, Renaissance, might fit, not as an exclamation but as a label for the long, dull climb that led from a confiscated security deposit to a published collection of poems. Outside fascination brought both opportunity and distortion. Certain clubs offered stages with money behind them, but insisted on seating arrangements that mirrored the wider city's limits. The neighborhood navigated these contradictions with the same pragmatism it used on laundry day. Work is work. Who sits in which chair is a fight for tomorrow morning's committee. For now, a musician took the gig because the money covered shoes and reeds, and because a full band deserved to keep playing. At the same time, other rooms insisted on openness and felt to the dancers like home, places where the line to get in was a thread of talk and laughter that could stretch halfway down the block without souring. A neighborhood learned to tell the difference, to reward the places that honored it, and to regard the others as temporary stages where one played well without giving away the puzzle's solution. In the houses, the routines continued. A man still set out his work clothes before turning to a notebook at the end of the day. A woman still ironed on Tuesdays and balanced the household accounts on Thursdays with a pencil pressed to the page in a steady hand that had steadied other lives. Children still learned to offer seats to elders on the streetcar and to walk around the block rather than cut through a private garden. The romance of the Renaissance rested on such discipline, the way a song rests on a rhythm section that keeps good time without calling attention to itself. When the crash came, when the city tightened, when jobs shrank, it was to these habits that people returned, quietly, without headline, in the still determination that had built the neighborhood in the first place. The end of the decade felt less like a curtain falling and more like a shift in the room's temperature. You noticed it first in the conversations about money, more pauses, more glances down at hands. The ballrooms stayed open. The theaters kept scheduling. The magazines continued to publish. But people measured their evenings differently, adding up expenses with a faint hesitation. Yet even this period contained a stubborn insistence on continuity. A teacher reminded her class that the library was still open until 9. A band leader rehearsed in a cold room because scales played in gloves are better than no scales at all. A sculptor used cheaper materials and more patience. The neighborhood had come too far on routine to abandon it now. Looking back, the arc is visible, private resilience forming public culture, and public culture feeding back into private morale. The names that fill histories are signposts along a road built by many hands that will never be named. Across those years, you could hear the same sound at the core of all the rooms, the scrape of a chair being drawn up to a table, the rustle of a page turned, the intake of breath before a note. It was a neighborhood practicing itself, and that practice is what let it become a story the world would tell and retell. The question that lingers as the lights dim at the end of this first story is both simple and deep. When the glamour is sifted away and the parties are gone, which parts of that steady practice do people carry with them into harder times? And how do those parts become the seed of what remains? You learn the lay of a country by traveling at night, tracing its bones by station lights and water towers, stopping in cities that are never fully asleep. For a generation of men who worked the sleeping cars, the nation was a series of timetables annotated in pencil. They moved through it with choreographed politeness and unflagging attention, carrying all the small equipment that seems trivial until a customer notices its absence: a brush with the right bristle, cream in a jar that must not spill, a damp cloth folded with the precision of a lesson repeated 100 times. What they also carried, often tucked into the same valises as their tools, were newspapers, folded tight, saved from a hotel lobby, purchased politely at a station stand. They traveled with their bearers back to the city where the men's families kept rooms, cooked meals, minded children, and waited for news. Those papers did more than inform. They recruited, guided, and connected. A young man in a small southern town read an advertisement promising factory wages in the north and wrote to a cousin in Harlem. The cousin asked a porter which blocks were safest, which landlords kept decent buildings, which nights the union met, which church served a hot meal if you arrived with nothing but your hat. The porter answered in detail because he had seen the rooms himself and had sat at the meetings in the hour between shifts. He knew not just the street names, but the feel of the stairwells, the look of a hallway at dusk, the sounds that meant a superintendent kept the building in order. He brought the news home and spread it the way news travels best, deliberately, person to person, measured out with care so as not to raise false hope. On a calm afternoon, you could watch a porter return to his building, still neat after an overnight run. He would hand a parcel through a doorway, sometimes a magazine, a pair of gloves, a letter delivered sooner than the post might manage. He might speak 2 minutes with a neighbor about a cousin arriving next week. He would note, without seeming to note, that the child of the woman upstairs had a cough, and would fold that observation into a list of errands that included a stop by a clinic's sliding scale hours. If you followed him down the block, you would see him pause in front of a newsstand, exchange a brief greeting with the man who kept it, and scan headlines with a practiced eye. A newspaper's contents were not merely stories. They were routes to a meeting, to a job, to a school, to a stage, to a line where a petition could be signed without too much fuss. There was another side to the information flow. The words were made, one line at a time, in rooms that smelled of ink and metal. You stepped into a print shop and felt heat hold steady like an old friend. The machines gave off a confident noise, a rhythm composed of gears and belts and the pressman's quiet adjustments. Type cases, divided into little compartments, held the alphabet's building blocks, uppercase separate from lower, each letter in its nest. A typesetter moved with quiet economy, plucking letters without looking, setting them into a stick. Muscle memory doing the work of eyes, so that thought could follow text. The editor, with sleeves rolled, read copy with a pencil circling and underlining, not out of disdain, but out of respect for the reader, who would trust this page more if it did not slight them with a misplaced comma or a sloppy proper name. These rooms had their own hierarchy and their own gentleness. A junior hand fetched coffee, not because it was his station in life, but because a press runs best when each person knows exactly how to lubricate the whole. A proofreader read aloud in a low voice, catching errors by ear that the eye had tired of seeing. A woman in a clean blouse cut columns with a knife and pasted them on a board, a skill that required a steady hand and a sure sense of spacing. When the deadline grew near, the pace quickened, but not recklessly. A good press crew did not panic. They kept time the way a good band does, no rushing, no dragging, a shared sense of where the downbeat must fall. Midnight was a frequent companion. The paper had to be ready when the men on the early trains reached for it at 6. The content of those papers was mixed by design. There were editorials that called the country to account, language sharpened by patience rather than anger. There were letters from readers that caught the quiet intelligence of the streets, inquiries about schooling, accounts of small injustices at work, arguments over tactics couched in the polite language of a church committee. There were pages of social notes that might seem frivolous to an outsider but served as a ledger of community: weddings, graduations, lodge promotions, choir anniversaries. To see your name printed correctly mattered because it meant you were a person counted in, not left out. It was proof once removed that your block existed and that it paid attention to itself. And in between these formal items, the advertisements taught their own lessons. Which stores sought your business? Which tailors cut their suits with care? Which undertakers handled grief with discretion and fair prices? In reading, you learn not simply what to think, but how to move through your days. The men who worked the trains formed unions that grew from whispered conversations in station rooms and blossomed into platforms with speakers who knew how to build an argument out of small facts. They understood leverage by timetable. If 1,000 shoes got shined and 1,000 beds got made every night, then 1,000 voices could negotiate for wages and respect with the same regularity, provided the voices kept time together. Meetings in Harlem halls were often both local and national, the way a crossroads is both a specific spot in the road and a concept for all spots like it. You sat in a room listening to talk of dues and grievances and realized you were listening to a geography lesson too, a map traced not by rivers and mountains, but by tracks and terminals, by the stops where a paper could be slipped into a hand and a promise into an ear. Train travel had its own etiquette that made its way back to city rooms. The insistence on neatness, the rule of silence in certain hours, the distilled art of addressing people who might or might not see you, these habits fortified the politeness that Harlem already prized. The men were paid for their perfect manners, but the neighborhood benefited from the same disposition doubled by pride. In a city that frequently insisted on slights, the act of meeting insult with crafted dignity worked like a lever. It moved much with little if you knew where to place it. And yet that same discipline contained a simmer of impatience, a readiness to turn organization into action when the hour struck. You heard both in speeches printed on the front page and in the slow, careful rebuttals printed on page 2. The paper routes were corridors. A bundle left a press room and travelled in under an hour to a tenement where an aunt ironed shirts to the rhythm of headlines read aloud by a niece. A boy carried a stack up a staircase so he could sell them to neighbours who wished to support the enterprise and learn the news. The penny or nickel mattered more than one might think. It trained the community to fund its own institutions, to conceive of information as a thing worth paying for, as necessary as bread and coal. A shopkeeper bought an extra copy and left it on the counter for customers to flip through between purchases. A pastor folded 3 copies under his arm on his way to the pulpit, and marked paragraphs he would trust with amplification on Sunday, trimmed of excess and delivered with reproofs designed to spur action without causing despair. The editor's desk was a clearinghouse not just for stories, but for lives. Mail came in fat envelopes, thin postcards, and scraps of paper folded twice, each containing a world of need, of argument, of hope. A woman wrote to ask if the paper would print her son's poem. A man wrote to ask whether the rumoured opening at a shop were true. A committee wrote to ask whether a speaker might be found for their next meeting. The editor read, set aside, marked, delegated, decided. This was not a distant profession. It was neighbourly, specific, sometimes exhausting. You went home after a 14-hour day and still felt words moving in your head like trains in the dark, stopping and starting according to a schedule you did not entirely control. If you followed a single issue from pitch to print, you would see how slow and deliberate the machinery could be when it worked well. A reporter brought in a story about a landlord who raised rents unfairly. An editor sent him back to verify details. A typesetter made room for a column by compressing another. The proofreader eliminated 3 errors that would have undercut trust. By the time a woman read the piece at her kitchen table, the work of a dozen people had been compressed into the quiet authority of ink on paper. She adjusted her glasses, read through to the end, and then put on her coat to attend a meeting she might have skipped if the article had been sloppy or the invitation vague. This is the practical influence of a press, the transformation of intention into attendance. Even the dullest aspects of production carried meaning. The subscription ledgers tracked not only payments but commitment. A list of renewed subscriptions was a portrait of a neighborhood in the act of saying yes again to itself. The addresses mapped the spread of the idea beyond a few blocks to distant boroughs and towns. In the margin beside a name, a clerk might note a change of address. Each change marked another thread in the weave of migration. The press taught itself to keep good records because good records kept the lights on. It was hardly romantic, but it was essential. At midnight, when the forms were locked and the plates inked, the first pages pulled looked like proof of a small, steady miracle. In the heavy silence that follows a press's run-up, the thud of paper arriving is a noise that never loses its pleasure. A man lifted a sheet, scanned the headline, and nodded softly. Then the crew went to work stacking, bundling, and loading. One by one, the papers crossed the gap from machinery to hands. By dawn, they were already folded on breakfast tables. By noon, they were read and reread in barber chairs. By late afternoon, their pages muffled the sound of a child's nap on a sofa. By evening, certain paragraphs were recited in lodge halls for those who had not yet had a moment to sit. Late that night, one copy lay on a piano, its fold making a faint crease on a page of sheet music where a player had been practicing. And perhaps that juxtaposition, headline and half notes, captured something essential about this place's slow, deliberate self-making. You sense that this machinery of information, porters carrying papers, editors making pages, was not merely an accompaniment to the neighborhood's culture, but a condition of it. How could poems and songs have found their audiences without the roots the papers maintained? How could meetings have filled without the schedules printed and delivered with devoted regularity? A neighborhood, like a press, runs on a rhythm set by its workers, and the workers learned to keep good time. The question that grows from this first tour through ink and rails is straightforward. If information stitched the city together so carefully in these years, what happened inside the newsrooms and basements where the words were made night after night? And how did those methods, those rules, those midnight habits shape the tone the movement took when it finally spoke in full? You return to the newsroom at the hour when the building grows quiet, when the vibrations from the streetcars settle into the floorboards, and the door to the stairwell closes with a soft, hollow sound. The press room downstairs hums in a measured way, as if the machines are thinking before they speak. In the office above, the editor's desk is a controlled mess. A square of lamplight, a paperweight shaped like a fist, a scattering of pencils sharpened to different lengths to match the different speeds of thought. This is where a neighborhood decides how to hear itself. It is not an exalted room. The window sticks on humid nights. The ashtray is too small. The calendar on the wall shows last month's date. But this is where the sentences are tuned, one after another, until they thread together into something a reader can carry through a day without dropping. You start with the stack of letters. They have a smell of kitchens and hallways, of ink from cheap pens and graphite from stubby pencils. A mother asks if the paper will post the time of a scholarship exam. A porter on layover in Omaha writes about a clerk who refused him service with a smile that hurt worse than a shove. A teacher requests copies for her class, promising to return them in good condition. A pastor encloses a program from a choir anniversary and asks, with a polite boldness, whether the editor might attend. There is a rhythm to how the letters are answered. The editor marks some with a blue pencil, others with a red, a few with a firm X that means, set this aside but do not forget. The replies are brief and formal. Even in refusal there is respect. A community can accept no only when it trusts that yes has been weighed carefully. Next come the small notices that feel like the city's pulse. Dances, lectures, union meetings, school recitals, charity suppers. If you lay them out on a table in the order they occur, you see the neighborhood's calendar as clearly as if it were written in stars. Labor on Mondays, lodges on Tuesdays, scripture midweek, concerts toward the weekend, rent parties whenever arithmetic requires them. The editor chooses which to feature where, and the reasons are not always grand. Sometimes a notice gets a better spot because the secretary who brought it in carries herself with a dignity that says her organization is the sort that starts on time. Sometimes it is because a group has been slighted too often. Sometimes it is because the hall they rented is too cold in winter and they deserve a larger crowd to justify the cost of extra coal for the stove. This is the editorial spine. Small decisions accumulated until they resemble policy. Advertising pays the bills. You study the proofs for errors in addresses and hours. A clothier who measures suits with an attention close to love. A grocer who keeps his fruit clean and his prices posted. A physician who treats without fuss. Each advertisement contains a set of promises, and the paper risks its own reputation when it prints them. The editor does not accept every ad. A rumor that a proprietor has cheated a widow on a delivery will cause a quiet request for cash in advance and a smaller placement. A good standing in the neighborhood is worth inches. It is tedious work to track these reputations, to keep mental notes on which baker uses the better flour and which barber keeps a steady hand on nervous boys. But the paper's authority flows through such judgments. You might think of influence as loud. It is not. It is the tone of voice that reads the listings and says, by placement and emphasis, this is trustworthy, this is not. This deserves your attention, this you can safely ignore. The reporters conduct interviews at kitchen tables. They learn to wait through the first telling, the second telling, and the moment in between, when a person stops protecting themselves with the story they prepared and begins to speak about the details that matter. The long walk home from a shift, the cold stairwell when the heat failed, the way a daughter sat up late copying a poem by hand because the book had to be returned by morning. Good reporting in these rooms is mostly patience. A notebook closes softly when the conversation turns private. Not everything needs to be printed to be true. The best reporters carry a compliment quietly. They can tell someone that their witness is valuable without promising a headline. In the end, the article that appears is short, measured, careful. It names a problem without making the subject into a spectacle, and it points toward a meeting or a person who can help. The reader who finishes it feels neither despair nor cheap triumph, but a desire to attend, to call, to show up. You walk the corridor to the composing room, where the linotype machines stand in a row like solemn beasts. Their chests glow with heat, and the operators sit at their keyboards with a concentration that invites whispering. Each keystroke summons a brass matrix that drops into place. Molten metal flows and cools into lines, slugs that carry words you can feel with your fingers. There is a satisfaction in this, thought turning into weight. The composing foreman checks a proof, holds it up to the lamp, and stares not at the shape of paragraphs, but at the edges of letters, looking for the small imperfections that cause ink to bloom where it should not. Speech must not be fuzzy. Typography is ethics set in metal. In the corner, a boy sweeps metal shavings into a pan. No one tells him yet that the work he is doing teaches him the steps of a ritual thousands of people will repeat in their heads when they read a headline on a streetcar. The union meets upstairs. The men come in from the tracks with their jackets buttoned to the top. They sit straight, not out of stiffness but out of habit. The talk is precise, timetables, grievances logged, hazards reported, with details that would make a bureaucrat nod. A man speaks of a conductor who talks down to porters in front of passengers. The story is told without ornament, the names given, the dates noted. Another tells of a manager who does the right thing without needing to be asked. Such notes are marked too. Discipline is not only what you demand, it is what you praise. The meeting breaks for coffee. A small plate of cookies appears. An envelope is passed without comment to help a man whose wife is ill. The envelope moves with a gentleness that comes of practice, and you know that when it returns to the table it will be heavier than when it started. This too is news, the kind that rarely makes a page but often decides a life. Back in the newsroom, the editor argues with a contributor about tone. The writer is angry. The editor is firm. Anger has its place, he says, but the front page needs to do something more practical than satisfy the righteous. It must be read in barber chairs and church pews, aloud at dinners and in whispers over the back fence. It must not frighten allies or bore the faithful. The writer bristles but listens. For all his fire, he knows the paper must fit under a coat on a rainy day and not bleed ink onto a lapel. They settle on a compromise, a strong first paragraph, a cooler middle, a conclusion that points not to fury, but to a meeting next week at the hall near the library. The headline takes shape as if by itself, but it reflects the negotiation, the balance between the heat that got the words onto the page and the cool air they must travel through to land where they can do work. Distribution is nighttime labor. Bundles tied with twine are stacked by doorways as if waiting to be carried into a different weather. Boys pedal bicycles with satchels over their shoulders. A man with a handcart makes 2 trips instead of 1 because he promised his wife he would not overstrain his back. Because a man must be present the next morning to lift his child, not just present to carry news while the city sleeps. At the corner where porters gather before a shift, a stack is placed on a bench. Hands reach without hurry. Coins clink. Men tuck the papers away with a neat motion, and when the train pulls out, will carry those pages across the boundaries of states, past lines that once felt hard as stone. The thought that a story you edited at midnight will be read at a station in a city you have never seen keeps you upright as you lock the office door at 2. You think of all the places the paper will go once the sun rises. A teacher will fold it under her arm and refer to an article as if it were a friend at the front of the room. A shoemaker will mark a paragraph with chalk and tell a customer to read while he finishes a heel. A woman on her way to a shift will memorize the time of an evening lecture and adjust her route so she can get there in time. A pastor will clip a sentence and paste it into a notebook for use next month, when the sermon's theme will need the gravity that only print seems to lend. And somewhere a boy will learn to love the blunt, simple music of headlines, how they sit on the page like instruments on a stand waiting to be played. The quiet power of the press is visible in the changes it records in the same small ways, month after month. A block association that once organized snow shoveling now organizes a lecture on tenants' rights. A reading circle that began with a novel moves next to essays on law. A union meeting notes that 5 new men joined after a speech that was advertised with a paragraph tucked near the middle of page 3. None of it is dramatic. All of it is drift. Culture changes not in leaps but by accumulation. The press teaches a neighborhood what to expect from itself by printing the expectation consistently until it becomes the rule. There are pressures from outside that never rest. A landlord threatens a libel suit. A politician hints at the withdrawal of a city contract. A printer worries about the cost of paper when the price rises without warning. These pressures are absorbed by a set of habits that grew up like ivy, slowly, stubbornly, holding to the wall even in winter. The habit of checking a fact twice. The habit of paying the paper bill on time, even if it leaves the office cold for a week. The habit of insisting that a name be spelled correctly because people live their lives in the small dignity of being seen as they are. You do not notice habits until they are tested. When they are, you see that what looked like fussiness was a form of strength. Sometimes, in the middle of editing a small domestic item, a child's prize at a school spelling bee, you feel a wave of sentiment you would be embarrassed to confess. The item is nothing. It will be forgotten in a week. But in printing it, you place a tiny weight on the scale against a world that tells that child he does not count. Not everything must be a manifesto. Many things must be a reminder. In the balance of reminders, a neighborhood learns its own weight. The porter you watched earlier comes by near midnight with a thermos of coffee. He sets it down on the desk and leans against the doorframe. The conversation is short. 2 sentences about a rumor of layoffs. 3 about a club that has begun to book more local bands. A mention of a woman who will need a hand if her husband is let go. The editor writes a note to call the club's manager for a schedule, another to assign a piece on seasonal work, a third to send a quiet word toward the lodge fund. When the porter leaves, the editor adds one more note. Add a line about the clinic hours to the community calendar. It will take up an inch of space. It may matter more than an editorial that took an hour to polish. If you look at the city at this hour, from a window above the avenue, you can see the storefronts that still have their lights on, a bakery finishing the morning's bread, a tailor hemming, a woman alone at a desk in a room above a shop, writing. A city that stays up to work does not congratulate itself. It counts receipts and reseals envelopes, but the staying up builds a fugue. The bakery's steam, the printer's ink, the porter's black coffee, the editor's pencil, all make a chord so quiet that only people inside it hear. The next day, the chord will become a line of type, read on a stoop by a man with his shoes off. And he will sigh and nod and say to no one in particular, as if to steady himself, "It's in the paper." You begin to see that the machinery of a movement is mostly ledger, calendar, and habit, that decisions made at midnight set terms for debates held at noon, that words laid in metal shape the path of footsteps on sidewalks the next day. Perhaps then the question for the closing of this section is simple and plain. When the presses stopped being novel and became routine, how did this nightly ritual, ink, metal, coffee, patience, conspire with the wider neighborhood to produce not just information, but a tone that whole crowds could carry like a shared melody? And at what precise moment did that melody swell into a voice the city could not ignore? By the time a paper becomes a habit, it has built a conversation with its readers that feels private and ordinary. You notice this in the subscription office, where the ledger carries not just names and amounts, but small, useful annotations. Moved upstairs, prefers to pay quarterly, lost job in February, hold until April. The clerk, an expert in the urban art of remembering, flips pages and knows where to find a scrawled note from last summer about a man who renews late, but always renews. The act of renewal is itself a statement. In a world where money has to stretch, to keep paying for words is to declare that words help you stretch further than you otherwise could. Across town, a barber props the latest issue on a shelf near the mirror, open to the page that lists meetings for the week. He taps the column with his comb when a customer asks what's happening tonight. In a teacher's staff room, 2 women mark the same page with pencil lines, comparing which lecture to attend. In a porter's lounge, a man cuts a headline and folds it into a wallet like a promise. A printer's devil, the boy who sweeps the press room, carries a crumpled copy in his back pocket until the back page gives out at the fold. By small acts of carrying and pointing, the paper grows from object to tool. When the time comes to move thousands of people through the city to a hall or a street, the tool is already in their hands, familiar as the lint at the bottom of a coat pocket. Slogans form naturally in such soil. They begin as headings or captions, worded neatly and not too long. A phrase circulates. It reappears in a letter to the editor. It is painted on a placard. It is repeated from a pulpit. Slogans do not change the world. They change the ease with which a world already moving can talk to itself while it moves. When an idea requires no long preface, when people can nod at 2 words and share a page of mutual understanding without the bother of explanation, acres of time are saved for action. You hear a slogan rehearsed in a backyard with a paintbrush. You see it on a scrap of cloth safety pin to a coat. You watch it unroll on a banner carried by women in hats who hold the pole with steady hands and do not set their shoulders in a way that invites mockery. It is not glamour, it is grammar. The paper supplies phrases that take root in parlor conversations and come out as a steady chant only later. The machinery's voice is tested in moments of stress. A strike is called. The paper prints the time and route of the march, the telephone numbers to call for legal aid, the names of those who will coordinate food. It also prints a reminder, leave the street as clean as you found it. The strike comes off calm and tight. The paper does not boast the next day. It prints a story that lists what went right and where they fell short. A reader eating a sandwich at his kitchen table nods at the list. He recognizes his own attention to detail in the way the paragraphs are built. He decides he can trust this voice the next time it asks him to risk an afternoon's wages. An uptown hall fills for a lecture on tenants' law. The paper has been running a series on leases and notices to vacate, boring subjects unless your bed sits under a roof that might slide from under you. The writer's tone is instructional, not fiery. She walks her readers through the clauses as if she were teaching a child to sew a hem. Slow, precise, repeat. At the lecture, people listen with the same patience. They have practiced their part by reading. When questions come from the floor, they are clear and short. This is what printed instruction buys: an economy of speech in public rooms that allows time for more voices. The union's newspaper, a smaller sheet, with fewer pages, runs profiles of men whose jobs most people do not see. A cook who keeps his galley spotless at 4 in the morning. A man who can change a berth from day to night in 3 minutes without a wrinkle. A clerk who tracks missing luggage with a memory that shames ledgers. The writing is modest and careful. The union understands that dignity grows in part from seeing one's craft on the page, named and described without condescension. Men who feel seen are less likely to turn the face a company expects and more likely to present the face a brother respects. The difference shows at negotiation time, when 1,000 men find the same beat without looking at one another. News publishing relies on a choreography that extends beyond the walls of the press room. A pastor agrees to shorten his announcement so the paper's list will fit. A school head allows a journalist to stand in the back with a notebook because she recognizes that good reporting takes time and space, and that the picture of the neighborhood the paper builds cannot be made only from big nights on big stages. The grocer holds a bundle for a boy whose bicycle has a broken chain. The barber gives him a couple of coins to make up for the time lost. A city that participates in its own information economy behaves with a peculiar neatness. People make room for one another's roles in the path of news because they have learned that when one role fails, the whole rhythm stumbles, the paper makes mistakes. A name is misspelled, an address is wrong, a photo caption errs. The editor prints a correction in a box where people will see it. He does not hide behind grey words. We regret the error is printed so often that the type for it seems to sit in a drawer all its own. The ritual of apology does not weaken the paper. It strengthens it. Readers learn that accuracy is honored not by pretense, but by amendment. A community so trained grows better at argument. You can say, "I was wrong," without losing face. You can receive, "You were wrong," without losing temper. That's a better floor for meetings than a carpet of silent resentments. Writers and readers grow together. The paper runs occasional workshops, informal, in the back room, where would-be contributors bring short pieces for critique. The instruction is gentle but unsentimental. Cut your first paragraph. Put the action up front. If you are angry, write cooler. If you are sleepy, write brighter. Men who have never set foot in a school that taught them to write sit up straighter when their sentences are taken seriously. Women who spend their days carrying other people's words through hallways on trays discover that their own words can be carried too. The press benefits. So does the city that watches ordinary voices find a tone fit for print. There are rival papers, and their competition keeps everyone honest. One is more theatrical. Another is quieter and stubborn. They disagree in public. Editors write open letters with crisp salutations that mask barbed sentences. Readers, for their part, buy both and talk through the differences on stoops. Rivalry in print becomes civility in practice because the terms of contest are visible. When the time comes to sit at the same table for a joint announcement, the editors do so with the respectful caution of men who have measured one another's sentences in public. Currents that could turn into dangerous rips in the street are kept in the channels of text. The paper's tone, steady, boring to an impatient outsider, is precisely what allows it to move people when it must. A parade is announced without fanfare, the route printed as if it were the directions to a cousin's house. At the appointed hour, thousands arrive with the unshowy punctuality of people who prefer not to waste their time. There are no surprises, and that is the strength. They march, they disperse, they go home to kitchens where supper has been planned around the march's timing. A city studies this reliability with a mixture of relief and alarm. Relief because order saves effort. Alarm because order well kept can be turned toward demands that will not drift away. By late in the decade, the press has taught the neighborhood to recognize itself in several recurring images. A brownstone stoop in early light, a row of hats at a lodge meeting, a girl in a library chair face bent to a page, a bandstand scene from the dance floor with the drummer a little to the left. By printing such scenes again and again with small variations, the paper suggests that the daily life it presents is not filler but essence. People come to crave the reassurance of seeing their ordinary days made visible. The extraordinary, when it comes, a prize, a visiting dignitary, a big performance, rests on a fabric that has been made familiar line by line. The crash comes, and the paper feels it first in the ledger. Advertisements thin, then thicken, then thin again, in a pattern that looks like breathing gone shallow. Subscriptions renew a little late. The office goes colder in winter. Still the presses run. The editor cuts his own salary, not to nothing because he has a family, but to a number that makes the difference between paying the paper bill and keeping the electricity on at home. No speech is made about this. It is recorded in no book. But the men downstairs tell the story among themselves because it pleases them to believe they labor for a man who knows how to set his jaw. The porters feel it too. A run is cut. A route is altered. A friend is let go. At the next union meeting, there is less coffee and more silence. The papers still make their way into satchels. In desperate times, information grows more precious. The paper runs features on relief offices, hours, qualifications, the way to fill out forms without losing an afternoon to bureaucracy. It prints profiles of clinics and lawyers who volunteer time. It warns gently of scams that prey on slim hope. It continues to list dances and lectures not as an act of denial, but as an assertion that people deserve calendars, not just clocks. In a world turned jagged by uncertainty, the smoother a paragraph reads, the more a reader relaxes into the sense that while money trembles, language can still hold. A generation trained by the press to assemble itself quietly does so for other purposes. Rent strikes, organized with neat ledgers and rotating committees, savings clubs that buy in bulk to stretch pennies into nickels, reading groups that meet twice a month without fail, not out of leisure but out of defiance against the way hardship eats attention. The paper documents these efforts as if they were weather reports. The banal tone is intentional. Heroics can exhaust a reader who must get up tomorrow and go again. A sensible sentence conserves energy. There is a night when a hall overflows for a reading by a young poet who has never before spoken to such a crowd. The paper, which has championed readings for years without asking repayment, has printed the time and place, a brief description of the subject, and nothing that smells like hype. People arrive early because they have been trained by a decade of schedules to respect beginnings. The poet reads in a voice so calm it surprises her. The room holds. Afterward, the column in the next day's paper is as plain as a weather report. It says what happened. It names the lines that made the room hush. And it says the next reading will be at the library on the Avenue Tuesday 7:30. If a messenger of the future told you that a social movement can be built partly on the back of such sentences, you might doubt it until you have watched a block come to life at the sound of a folded paper tapping against a stoop. The machinery, in the end, does not roar. It speaks. It has spent years teaching itself to speak in a tone that people will bring into churches, barbershops, schools, kitchens, and clubrooms without embarrassment. And that tone becomes the city's inner voice during the hours when the outer voices are too loud. If there is a climax here, it is not a headline, but a habit, a morning ritual of reading and choosing that can, when needed, become a ritual of walking and standing together. And so, as this story closes, the thought that lingers is not the romance of ink or the drama of trains, but a question you can feel in your pocket, like the memory of folded newsprint, when the presses kept that steady beat through thick and thin. Which phrases, which listings, which patient instructions remained lodged in the city's throat, ready to be sung again in the next room and the next. You step into a parlor that smells faintly of wax and coffee, the scent of preparation and welcome. The room is not large, but the furniture has been arranged with a geometry of inclusion. Chairs pulled close enough to make voices carry without strain. A small sofa pushed against the wall to leave a clear space in the middle for a reader to stand. A table that has been cleared of everything but a plate of cookies, a bowl of fruit, and a stack of slender magazines that look as if they have been read with care. The hearth holds a modest fire for winter evenings. The windows open easily in summer. The doorbell rings at intervals like a soft metronome, and each arrival brings a layer of sound. Boots on the hallway tile, a polite greeting, a brief appraisal of the room by eyes that tally who else is there before settling into the pleasure of being here at all. The hostess, who will never call herself that in print, moves with brisk kindness. She takes a coat, offers a seat, introduces a newcomer to a teacher from the school on the avenue, and asks a regular to pour coffee. Her questions are ordinary and exact. How is your mother's knee? Is your brother still working the late shift? Did the library get the new shipment? Are you writing? She has learned that the surest way to foster culture is not to ask about culture, but to ask about life. The answers guide the evening as surely as any program. If she hears that a man has lost work, she will nudge a conversation toward practical leads. If she hears that a girl has discovered a poet who sets her heart jumping, she will find the book on the shelf and hand it over with a finger marking the page where the poem starts fast. The first hour is talk. People warm to the room before they will submit to a poem. The talk seems unfocused to an impatient ear, but it follows lines that echo the city's own map. Classrooms, hallways, church basements, stage doors, back rooms of bars where discussions outlast the last train. A teacher tells a story about a student who returned a book on time and then came back to the desk just to say, "Thank you," for how the book smelled. A porter tells about a morning when a woman traveling alone complimented him on his quietness, and he wondered what quietness looks like from the seat that costs more. A librarian describes the feeling of discovering an old pamphlet in a crate, a speech printed 40 years ago that says something the room needs to hear tonight. The readings begin without announcement. A man stands and unfolds a slip of paper from a vest pocket. His voice is unremarkable, which is its charm. The room leans forward not to be transfixed by a performance, but to share the burden of catching the words. He reads about a window above an avenue that shows a slice of sky that never seems to change, even when the weather does. He reads about the way a child's hand feels in a glove one size too big. He reads about the difference between a rented room and a home, a difference that can hinge on a nail in a wall where a photograph hangs straight. When he sits, the room does not clap. It breathes. The comments that follow are practical. Someone says the line about the glove needs one fewer word. Someone else says the window should be on page 1 and not 2. The woman who keeps the notes at these gatherings writes suggestions down with handwriting that would put a ledger to shame. She will copy them later for the reader with a note of encouragement and a list of magazines that might accept this kind of work if it were revised. A field of art grows where there are gardeners who know that a plant needs watering on Thursdays and a stake tied at mid-season to keep it from Leaning too far into the path, a music student sits at the piano and sets her fingers in motion. Scales first, because habits are the bones of practice. Then a small piece, light as a boy's whistle on the way to school. Then a melody that sounds like the avenue at dusk. The room does not shush itself. It adjusts. The conversations drop into pockets and the music floats between them. When she finishes, a man in a chair near the window asks whether she has tried it in a lower key. She has. She says the room requires this key because the instrument is modest and the walls are thin. Everyone laughs softly. Truth has been spoken without anyone losing face. Teachers anchor the room. They know the names of the children who come after school to the library or the settlement house. They know which boy reads slowly but loves the maps, and which girl finishes books early and waits patiently for someone to notice that she needs more. They keep lists in their heads. Who should meet the editor of a small magazine? Who should introduce a new dancer to a choreographer? Who should be told that a certain reading at the library might be life-altering if only they can get there on time? The teacher's presence makes a kind of contract. The room must be useful, not merely entertaining. The conversation will tilt toward the practical. Deadlines, drafts, rehearsals, rent, out of respect for the limited hours of people who borrow against sleep to make room for art. The modest funds that keep a salon solvent are managed with care. A few friends contribute quietly each month, not as patrons, but as neighbors. The hostess keeps a tin on a shelf with coins and small bills, and a ledger where she notes what was spent on coffee, on biscuits, on a book that had to be bought because the library's copy was always out. She tracks who borrowed which magazine, and she is not embarrassed to remind people to return them by the next meeting. There is no shame here. There is stewardship. The room is a commons, and commons survive by habit as much as by generosity. Some nights are crowded, some are thin. The thin nights matter more. A room that can function when only 6 people show up is a room that will still be there when winter is long and the trains are late. On those evenings, the conversation goes deeper into craft. A poet admits that a line is not yet honest. A painter confesses that the canvases are piling up in a corner because he cannot afford frames. A singer asks whether anyone knows a seamstress who can fix a dress for a late booking. Solutions are traded, names offered, promises made in simple sentences that do not need flourish to be binding. The room's currency is practical help delivered with speed. You notice how the salon bends time. A man who spent his day delivering packages speaks with a scholar who spent his day among rare books, and they do not seem to care about the gap in their circumstances because the room has made the subject of conversation higher than status. The packages contain clocks, he says, and the scholar tells him about a medieval treatise that measured the hours by prayers and bells. They find, in the trivial and the grand, an agreement. Time must be shaped if art is to live. They propose different methods for shaping it, he by waking early, she by discarding 3 unimportant errands, and they both leave with a sense of having learned something they can use by Tuesday. Children drift through the room on some evenings, sent by parents who prefer their youngsters to sit among listening adults rather than drift the stairs. They are given small tasks that make them proud. Pass the cups, fetch the second plate of cookies, pick up the pencil that rolled under the chair. They watch the grown-ups read and argue. They learn by osmosis that art is not magic, but attention, that conversation is not a fight, but a construction project. Some will remember years later how a woman they did not know smiled at them while tucking a blanket around their lap when they fell asleep in a corner chair. They will remember the cadence of a poem without recalling the words, the shape of a melody without a title. In that way, a room goes on working long after the chairs have been stacked and the light turned off. Magazines serve as passports. A new arrival brings one in, folded to a page where a story by a writer nobody yet recognizes grips him with an unembarrassed happiness. He reads a paragraph aloud and the room murmurs in appreciation. The hostess writes the writer's name on an index card, and pins it on the wall near the calendar. She keeps such cards as if they were seeds planted for a garden to come. The wall becomes a quiet map of influence. Names of people to watch, of places to visit, of themes that keep recurring in the conversation like a familiar star in the evening sky. Sometimes, a visitor from downtown or from farther away sits in. They look around, expect a performance, and are surprised to find a workshop. The surprise is instructive. This is not a show. It is work in progress, done with the privacy of neighbors and the seriousness of householders. The visitor relaxes or bristles. If they relax, they will speak when invited, contribute a thought about a line break or a chord. If they bristle, they will ask why the room refuses to present itself as something more glamorous. And the answer will be a gentle shrug. We are building walls and windows here, not polishing mirrors. A librarian from the branch on the avenue often brings a book truck in her mind. She talks of what is on order, what is on the shelf, what has gone missing, what has been found tucked behind a fat dictionary as if a child wanted to save it for another day. She describes the new collection of pamphlets on law, on health, on the lives of people in other cities who are doing similar work. The room listens and recalibrates. If a pamphlet exists on rent strikes, the evening's talk will make room for a visit next week by someone who has led one. If a book of poems arrives that speaks directly to the room's current preoccupation, it will be read aloud at the next meeting. The branch and the parlor form a loop of attention that keeps new thinking in circulation. If you watch long enough, you see the etiquette that holds the room steady. People take turns. People do not speak over the reader. People disagree with sentences, not with persons. The hostess enforces these rules with the lightest touch, a glance, a small cough, the deft insertion of a question that redirects without shaming. The result is a pace that permits depth. The evening breathes, the way a city breathes after a hot day, slowly, gratefully, with a trust in the cool air that comes only because the windows have been opened carefully. By midnight, coats are claimed, chairs are pushed back to their usual places, cups are washed and set to dry, and promises are repeated. I'll bring the book. I'll ask the editor. I'll make the introduction. I'll sew the hem. I'll copy the parts. I'll send the list. I'll be there at 7. The hostess writes a few notes to herself on a slip of paper. Order more coffee. Return the library book. Check on Mrs. R's knee. Ask Jay whether he found work. Remind Elle to submit by Friday. She places the slip under the sugar bowl where she will see it in the morning. She turns off the lamp and lets the room go dark with the satisfaction of someone who knows that tomorrow's light will find things in their places. As you step out into the hallway and down the stoop, the block is quiet enough to feel like a folded page. A street lamp hums. Somewhere a piano practices scales so softly you might think you imagined it. Inside your coat, your own notes rustle. You will sleep and return to your own routine, but the room has changed the ratio by which your day is divided. It has suggested that an hour can be stretched to hold 2 purposes if attention is applied properly, and that a neighborhood can increase the supply of courage with simple, steady gatherings. The question that drifts with you like your breath in the cool air is this: when a dozen rooms like this one open their doors on the same block, at the same hour, night after night, which habits of mind and heart escape their thresholds to become the invisible architecture supporting a culture that, to outsiders, looks spontaneous? You find your way back to the parlor in the early evening when the hallways smell faintly of chalk and wool, and the day has settled enough to allow for attention. If you pause by the door, you notice small changes that signal a different kind of work tonight. Sheets of paper rest under paperweights arranged in a neat grid on the table. A short ladder leans near the bookcase, ready for someone to find a volume kept high because it is consulted often, but not casually. On the mantel, instead of a vase, sits a little box of pencils, sharpened with care, their points like quiet intentions. The room is ready not merely for conversation, but for making under the supervision of those who keep students awake through afternoon lessons and keep their own minds awake with late-night reading. Teachers and mentors are tonight's gravity. They know that craft can be coaxed into sturdiness with a structure that does not call attention to itself. The opening movement is nearly silent. Seats chosen, coats folded, papers arranged. The hostess, whose presence you have learned to read like a clock, hands out slips that are not quite assignments and not quite invitations. Write 3 images from your day and tie none of them to anything grand, says one. Describe a sound heard from another room without naming its source, says another. On the piano, a small metronome clicks occasionally, a reminder that thought benefits from a pace. A teacher of composition in a neighborhood school takes one corner and draws a simple chart on a scrap of paper. Image, movement, pause, return. He does not explain it. He simply leaves it near the fruit bowl, trusting that someone will look and see the pattern in their work, as a map with no legend still shows the roads. The first reader of the night is a young man whose timing in conversation tends to be either too fast or too careful. He begins with a sentence that moves at the speed of a winter bus. Steady, a little hesitant at stops carrying weight. He describes the way an apartment sounds when there is a baby asleep in one of its rooms. Voices lowered without order from anyone. Pots set down gently. The sudden hush when a drop of water hits the stovetop and hisses. He does not reach beyond the room. He does not claim universals. He gives you the door handle turning with care, a coat sleeve brushed against a chair to see whether the wool will whisper. The teacher with the chart nods once, the nod of recognition rather than approval, as if to say that accuracy, when it is achieved, needs no compliment to continue. Guidance takes the shape of questions, simple as bus schedules and just as useful. What is the exact angle of the light under that door? Asks a woman who has taught handwriting to fidgety students for 20 years and knows how to extract patience in half-minute increments. Is it the kind of light that looks like a line or the kind that looks like a fog? The reader blinks, then answers, a line. The teacher nods, satisfied that a vagueness has been turned into a measurement. Across the room, the librarian speaks without looking up from a book. If you want that kind of light in a poem, cut the adjectives, leave the nouns as they are, and make the verbs work harder. Someone laughs softly. It is not a joke so much as a relief to be told the work is achievable with tools already in the box. The evening rounds a corner toward rhythm. A young woman unfolds paper she has worn soft by rereading. She has written about a classroom, a child who forgets to raise a hand because the answer sits too hot on his tongue, another who always raises a hand and cannot bear it when her answer is not called. She describes chalk dust as a weather that settles on everyone, regardless of who has talked too much and who has said too little. The detail that catches is small and effective, an eraser cleaned against the brick outside, leaving a ghost rectangle that anyone can find later in the week if they look down instead of ahead. A quiet murmuring passes through the room, that sound a kettle makes before it boils. It is the sound people make when their memory has been seen by a stranger. Properly and without presumption, a painter speaks next with words, because canvases are expensive and the light is wrong tonight for colors anyway. He talks about frames as if talking about rooms, their cost. The way a frame decides whether a picture looks like a window or a box. The way a cheap frame apologizes for itself when set beside real wood made patient by sanding. He has learned that to keep painting in a season when money withdraws, he must master patience and barter. He knows which hardware store owner will let him pay next week if he writes his name clearly and does not ask twice. He knows which friend can be trusted to carry a canvas downstairs without letting the corners scrape. If there is art somewhere in the future, it will sit partly on the back of these dull and necessary arrangements. At the piano, a teacher begins what she calls a drill, but treats like play. She asks 3 students to stand in a row. She plays a pattern, and they are to walk in time toward the window and back, then to walk the same distance in half time, then in 3/4. Laughter makes an entrance as one student miscalculates a turn and ends up closer to the fire than intended. But the exercise is not vanity. It teaches scale to people who will one day read on a stage and must know in their bones how long a sentence takes to travel across a room, how much breath belongs to a clause, how to let silence reach the last row without letting it turn into a stumble. When they sit, they are different without quite knowing why. Their bodies have been tuned to measure without a ruler. Lists circulate. A sewing teacher writes the names of two seamstresses who can be trusted to hem a dress in a hurry without grumbling, and two more who cannot. A clerk from the library writes the hours of the new reading room. A teacher notes the dates of the next scholarship exams and the forms needed to sit. The room works like a notice board in a station, except the trains of books, rehearsals, deadlines, small performances in back rooms and basements where the chairs are borrowed and the floor must be swept afterward. You feel the usefulness of it in your shoulders where worry lives. It lightens when a line is added to a small card. Tuesday, 7. Bring 2 copies. Borrow no more than you must. Leave the room better than you found it. When the air grows warm and the conversation risks drifting toward comfort, a mentor who has seen many drafts come and go steers the room back toward discipline. She reads a paragraph of description and then removes one sentence like a brick from a wall. The structure shifts. It does not fall. She removes another brick. The shift is now obvious to everyone. What is left is better. She says, gently, that it is better because it trusts the reader and because it refuses to waste their minutes on words that do not pull their weight. You learn in that moment, without being scolded, that revision is not punishment. It is courtesy. It is the clean shirt put on before going to the neighbor to ask a favor. It is the better shoe worn to the meeting where a vote will be taken. The evening circles back to a teacher who is not formally trained in anything except living here long enough to know how blocks change with the year. She tells, in a steady voice, of an after-school room where children practice penmanship on wide-lined paper, the air tasting like paste and apples. She describes how the impatient ones learn to form letters by drawing the path of the letter with a finger in the air first, a whisper of movement that becomes pen pressure only after the muscle remembers. She says, almost casually, that a similar trick can be used by adults who wish to speak without shaking. Practice in the air. Then the voice will follow the path you have drawn for it. The advice is neither poetic nor grand. It will stick anyway because it solves a real problem simply. Mentorship here is more durable than applause. A visiting writer sits in the corner, quiet through most of the evening, and at the end reminds everyone that submitting to journals is a chore, not a destiny. He lists, slowly and without irritation, the steps to take. Read the journal. Follow the guidelines. Expect silence. Send again. Keep a simple ledger of submissions like any other habit worth tracking. Do not be dramatic. Be persistent. Assume nothing is personal. His sentences are short enough to memorize on a walk home. The room nods because it recognizes the familiar shape of his instructions. They are the size of daily life. There are disagreements because a room full of people trying hard to make something will disagree. Tonight somebody insists that a poem has too much patience, that the times require more heat. Another insists that heat is cheap patience, dear. The hostess lets the conversation rise a little, like bread. Then she presses it down gently by asking each side to name one sentence in the poem that both admire. They each find one. The room exhales. The poet takes notes. The apprentices watch, absorbing a technique for living where passions can be high and tempers low at the same time, a metropolitan skill as crucial to survival as learning the cadence of a late train. If you step into the hallway for air, you will see, on a little side table, a stack of school notebooks with names written carefully on their covers. They do not belong to children. They belong to adults who have decided their work deserves the dignity of being kept in order. Their pages carry exercise after exercise. Describe a kitchen without naming a single object. Map your block using only sound. Write a conversation in which nobody answers the question asked. Assignments like these look unglamorous, stacked in the grey light near a stairwell, but this is how a culture is built practical and strong. The way a bridge is strong not because of its arches, but because of its bolts. The night ends with a small ritual. Each person turns to someone at hand and shares in a single sentence what they will make before the next meeting. No speeches, no disclaimers, no explanations. "I will light the hallway lamp," says one. "I will cut the 6th line," says another. "I will sew the hem and bring tea," says a third. The hostess smiles, not because she is pleased with them, but because the vows are of a size that will fit between work and sleep. As coats are claimed and good nights are said, the teachers linger to wash the cups, to check the window latches, to pull the chairs back just so. They know the room must be respectable in the morning when it returns to being a room where breakfast is eaten and bills are paid. Craft is not a separate life. It is a way of arranging the same life according to a slightly stricter list. When you descend the steps and turn toward the avenue, the city looks like a draft that has been improved with quiet edits. Trash cans pulled tight to the curb, a stoop swept with 2 extra strokes, a window blind straightened. You cannot prove that this particular room caused these small rightnesses. Perhaps the rightnesses caused the room. Either way, as you walk past the branch library returning its last readers to the night, you find yourself holding a question that will not quite resolve before sleep. When a district learns to practice small accuracies together, sentence by sentence, measure by measure, stitch by stitch, how exactly do those accuracies escape the parlor and the classroom to become a public temperament? The kind that can carry a hall without shouting and move a city block toward a purpose without anyone needing to raise a hand? The room looks nearly the same on the night it graduates from practice to presentation. The chairs are set closer together. A short curtain borrowed from a church basement has been hung between 2 hooks to conceal a makeshift backstage. A lamp has been moved to cast an honest light on the reader's face rather than a flattering one. Programs, if they can be called that, sit in a small stack on the table. They are typed on thin paper and list only names and titles. There are no grand introductions planned, no mystery guests, no promises of surprise. The promise here is routine executed cleanly. The door will open on time, the room will be warm enough and not too warm, and the readers will be heard without strain. This is the house style learned from the city's ordinary days. Clarity first, then feeling, then celebration. The curtain knows its job and will not announce itself. The first reader is a teacher who has been postponing the moment she must test her voice. She begins, and you notice how the room carries her, the way a well-built stoop carries weight without creaking. Her piece is about contracts, not the legal kind, though those appear, but the domestic kind that people make every day without paper. She speaks of the contract to stop and listen at the top of a stairwell when someone is crying in another apartment, the contract to return a dish unchipped, the contract to watch a neighbor's door when they are away, and to turn a blind eye when their cousins crowd into a room because there is nowhere else for them to sleep. Each contract she names is small, and yet each builds the scaffolding that holds up the big agreements later. The ones about union, about rent, about how a neighborhood will show itself to the city. A painter steps forward not with a canvas, but with a slide, a single image projected onto the wall with a portable lantern device someone has tinkered into effectiveness. It shows a corner at mid-afternoon, streetlight, second-floor window, a cat washing itself on a sill, 2 hats facing each other at the exact angle of a conversation about jobs and weather. He talks for 5 minutes about edges, the edge of light, the edge of attention, the edge of patience. He shows how the painting is less about the cat than the 2 hats, and less about the hats than the 2 lives under them, and less about the 2 lives than the space between, which is the same size as a phrase like "I hear you" or "go ahead" or "I'll wait." The image dissolves. The applause is brief and dense. The room understands that he has used their time well. Music arrives without motion. A girl sings from the doorway. The trick is simple and elegant, without a forward step. She fills the room because the position aligns her voice with the ceiling's curve and makes the corners of the parlor act like the body of a second instrument. The song is small, about a dress mended twice and the memory that refuses to fade with the fabric. It is a lesson in how to scale work to fit the vessel available. When she steps back into the hallway, the focus holds as if someone had placed a brown paper cover over a library book to keep it clean for the next borrower. The room rewards her with quiet that lasts longer than the applause. Between the scheduled pieces, there are errands that look like love and are actually logistics. Someone replenishes the chairs with extra cushions borrowed from the bedroom, not because comfort is owed, but because shoulders endure better when the small panes are removed. Someone opens the window a crack, because breath on breath makes rooms too warm in winter. Someone moves the plate of cookies 2 inches away from the corner where the program will be collected to lighten the bottleneck that might otherwise complicate arrivals. These micro-adjustments are the parlor's wisdom applied to hospitality. If you were inclined to exaggerate, you might call them strategy. But you are not inclined to exaggerate. You have learned that the most persuasive rooms are the ones that tell the truth about how they hold together. Later in the evening comes a conversation about contracts in the larger sense, the agreements with venues, the small arrangements that govern whether a performance will be paid or merely applauded, the rules for submitting to a magazine that must keep the lights on while also keeping faith with its readers. A musician explains how a handshake can serve when the people involved share a block and a memory, and how a sheet of paper is necessary when the people involved share nothing but money. A writer talks about clauses, about reprint rights, about the lawful pride of having one's name spelled correctly in a program, and the lawful indignation when it is not. The room is not bored by this talk. It understands that dull knowledge protects fragile work, and that there is no shame in pausing a poem long enough to read a contract carefully. The conversation tilts toward the children, their education, their attention, their restlessness. A teacher recites the day's plan for the next week, and you can hear the architecture of care in it. Arithmetic balanced with reading. Recess placed where fatigue usually rises. A poem at the end of the day when minds are too tired for fact, but still hungry for pattern. She speaks of chalkboards wiped with care and lessons held in place by routine. Someone asks whether art belongs in such a schedule. She nods. It belongs like warm water in winter, distributed, predictable, not scalding, not scarce, not subject to whim. The children who live in a city that keeps them guessing deserve classrooms that do not. Before the final reading, the hostess folds back the curtain herself and pulls a cord that shifts the shade from lamp to lamp as if the parlor were taking a breath. She announces a single rule for the last portion of the evening. No advice, only gratitude. The last reader is a seamstress who has written about a hem as if it were a sentence. She speaks about the backstitch and the knot that must be hidden, about how fabric holds memory of the last form it wore and must be convinced to let go with patience and heat. Her voice trembles once. The room does not correct it. When she finishes, there is no critique, only a series of short thanks for the chairs, for the cookies, for the sentence about knots, for the reminder that craft looks like care from close-up. The absence of advice feels like a gift wrapped in brown paper and string, plainly marked and handed across a counter with pleasure. When the curtain comes down, if a piece of fabric hung from 2 hooks can be said to come down, you notice what is left on the table. Smudged programs, pencils worn one side flat, a small heap of the papers people used to keep their place in a book. Nothing looks exceptional, which is part of the point. A night dedicated to art has left a room arranged almost exactly as it began, with only a few signs that strangers have touched the furniture. This is how a parlor can be used again tomorrow for a child's homework or a conversation about a cousin's new job or a quiet nap. The room has left a residue of carefulness that will make the next task easier, whatever it is. As the last guests leave, the hostess and two teachers share a conversation that sounds less like celebration than planning. Who will take the stack of drafts to the library for copying? Who will check on the girl with the song to see whether she needs shoes resoled? Who will draft a gentle set of guidelines for payments when the next event is held in a room where a door fee must be collected? Their talk is stripped of grandeur. It is the talk of a city that knows how to continue. The teachers pull the curtain down and fold it with the same respect they would give to a poem. The hostess wraps the pencils in a cloth napkin so the points won't snap. The room is returned to itself. You walk home through air that has turned crisp. The avenue in front of the library is quiet, yet you feel that if you reached into your pocket, you would find a list there that you didn't write. Lamp, paper, chair, thank the doorman, return the cup, sweep the step, cut the extra sentence, bring the book back on time, fix the hem. It feels a little like a contract you have made without saying so. Perhaps every good room sends its people out carrying such contracts unwritten. You wonder, as you find your key and listen for the near-silent click of the lock, what will remain when the room's empty for good, when fashions change and stages move and money arrives with new demands? Will the careful habits of this parlor hold their shape when the neighborhood is asked to suffer differently, or will they bend and snap and be replaced by other tools for other times? Afterglow and winter, you feel the change first in the talk at the counter. Prices begin to move in little jolts the way a train sometimes lurches even before you hear the whistle. The butcher looks down when he quotes the cost of a cut that last month lived in a different column of your memory. On 7th Avenue, a clerk takes longer to make change. She seems to be counting more than coins. This is how a downturn arrives in a neighborhood already expert in the math of not quite enough. There is no crash in the sound sense, no single thud that tells you when the hour turned. There is instead a steady subtraction. A man who always bought oranges for his son's cough stands in front of the pile and chooses fewer than he had hoped. A woman who wore gloves in winter because dignity is a warmth of its own decides to keep her hands bare on the walk to the hall. Ledgers become stories. A landlord who kept a steady book now flips pages back and forth, trying to find patterns that will let him treat a tenant fairly and still pay his own bills. A union treasurer sits in a room with weak heat and counts dues with a pencil in a mitten because a woman who keeps better books than anyone in 3 blocks will not let cold make her casual about arithmetic. A church committee accustomed to planning suppers begins planning lines. They debate how to serve so that pride is not scraped away along with the last spoonful at the bottom of a pot. The debates are technical: how to stagger arrivals, how to rotate volunteers, how to rearrange benches to keep bodies warmer by their closeness without making the air oppressive. It is work done by people who would prefer to be discussing a lecture. Numbers take on different meanings. 10 cents is not a coin. It is a choice between bread and soap, between car fare and string. A quarter is a week's worth of light in a room with a lamp that casts a glow too dim for reading, and yet is better than dark. $50 is not easily found and therefore becomes an occasion, the kind that leads to a conversation at the kitchen table about which obligation should be honored first. The arithmetic is honest and close, and it makes people quieter. Even the loud talkers on the corner soften their voices for a season. You can hear the train more clearly now, the metal-on-metal echo on the air, as if the city itself knows it must listen harder to timing. Work narrows. The porter's runs change. The schedules compress. Men gather at the lounge with news that comes in the simple form of yes or no. A woman who kept 3 houses clean finds that one family now sweeps its own stairs and another has moved to a smaller apartment. A girl who took dictation for a lawyer now copies letters addressed to creditors with more apology than law in them. In the evenings, meetings do not empty, but they drag. People are slower to rise to speak. They conserve words as if conversation had become a rationed substance. yet they still come, which is an argument made with bodies rather than sentences. Rent parties keep their promise and multiply. The arithmetic is open and known. A flyer carries the date and the reason in a hand that has written the same words before. Short this month. Hospital bill. Work cut. Heat. People bring coins and feet and a willingness to be seen in a neighbor's parlor, looking not festive but determined. There are rules that everyone honors because the rules are not etiquette but survival. A coat will be watched without anyone asking. A bottle will be poured into cups and not mouths. A floor will be respected as if it were a borrowed book. The music is strong because the band owes 3 bills and knows that good playing is the kind of honesty people crave when everything else wobbles. Shops adjust in public. A grocer quietly adds a basket near the register where customers can leave a small coin for those who come up short and take one when needed. He keeps no sign and trusts the corner to make the custom known by whisper. The barber lengthens the interval between shaves for old customers who have paid regularly for a decade. He does not announce this policy. He implements it by telling a story to a waiting room that can tell a story from a rule. The tailor replaces a broken button without charge more often than he used to, and he tightens a seam for a woman who will repay him when the season changes. These adjustments do not solve the depression. They rearrange it, softening the edges with habit. The press compresses its pages and doubles its usefulness. Fewer advertisements leave more space for small instructions. How to sign up for relief without being sent from desk to desk. How to write a letter to a landlord that keeps the tone low and the point clear. Where to find a clinic in the late afternoon when a child's forehead is too warm and an adult's judgment will not be despised. The newsroom keeps the same late hours with fewer lights, men hunched over proofs wearing coats indoors, hands cupped around coffee that tastes more of necessity than pleasure. Yet the columns arrive, and a woman reading them at her sink in the morning decides her day will begin with a list, and the list will be done in an order that leaves room for a small good thing if energy remains. The library becomes warmer without raising the thermostat. People lean toward one another at the big tables and exchange more than books. A clerk notes on a side sheet the names of those who should be told when a shipment of pamphlets arrives, because the pamphlets tell unglamorous truths about how to deal with offices, how to read a form, how to find a place for a child to sit in a class that is already too full. Children learn that the library can be counted on to hold its hours even when stores shrink theirs. They develop the habit of walking in without looking around, as if the threshold were their own stoop. This habit may be the most radical thing obtained in those years. Church basements absorb an extra duty. A room that held coats in winter now holds men in winter, their voices kept low by choice rather than rule. A woman who has always managed kitchens finds that recipes multiply when she writes them for economies nobody taught her in cooking school, because there was no school for this kind of cooking. She knows how many servings a pound of beans yields depending on how long they simmer and what is told to the line so that each bowl does not get greedy. She is a scientist without a lab coat, measuring outcomes without applause. If there is a line outside, she keeps it moving, not with orders barked, but with the steady offer of something on a spoon and the steady refusal to let a person stand too long in the cold. Schools hold. Teachers create units that don't require new materials because new materials require new money. A science lesson becomes a study of the block, what drains well and what floods, what trees lose their leaves last and why, which birds stay through winter and which take the train of air south. A writing lesson becomes a letter to a cousin asking whether the rumors of work are true, and a math lesson becomes a ledger in which students track imaginary accounts. Learning to balance innocence against experience without being told that is what they are doing. The classrooms do not shut their doors to hardship. They hold the door open to let hard air in and then show children how to breathe it without panicking. The numbers racket, which was never a game here so much as a shadow bank, continues to serve its blunt function, loans at a cost, managed by people who make decisions fast and observe faster than any credit manager south of the park.
Moralists shake their heads.
Mothers feed their children with a steak that came through a kitchen window wrapped in newspaper after a conversation conducted in a code the block learned with its afternoon tea. You can disapprove from a distance. Up close, the important thing is whether the heat stays on and whether the boy gets the tooth pulled before the infection spreads. The city is built of systems, official and unofficial. In a depression, the unofficial keeps showing up on time. In all this, you notice endurance shrinking towards something spare and powerful. Dinners are plainer. Coats are repaired rather than replaced. Parties emphasize warmth more than spectacle. Readings are as crowded as ever, but the applause is tighter, as if people are conserving noise for something urgent. Even the certainty that morning will come seems tempered by the knowledge that it might arrive later than expected and with fewer promises. Yet morning does come, and the block wakes, and the floor gets swept, and the teacher stands in front of children with a book in hand and a lesson planned. What looks like routine from the outside is survival from within. The years 1929 to 1931 do not break the neighborhood. They narrow it like a river in a drought, carving a deeper channel between its banks. The current strengthens because it must. The art does not vanish, it changes scale. A poem is cut to fit the time a woman has before her bus. A song lowers the key to meet a tired voice. A painting uses charcoal because it is cheap and honest. The parlor still fills, the church still gathers, the club still books a band, the press still prints.
Only the margin for error has shrunk, and everyone knows it as surely as they know the weight of a nickel.
So you end the year with questions you know will not be resolved soon. Which of these narrowed habits will become permanent, and which will be allowed to expand when money loosens? And how will people remember what this season taught them without wishing for its return? The second winter asks for a different kind of cleverness. The city begins to send men with clipboards to count and measure, to promise work that will arrive in teams and trucks, to open offices where forms make lines and lines make tempers thin. You see signs for projects that sound both important and ordinary. Fix the stairs in the park, paint the walls of the school, count the trees, teach a class in the afternoon. The initials that stand for federal programs become part of speaking, like nicknames for relatives long in town. The point is simple: put hands to tasks that can be seen. The hands in Harlem have always worked. Now the work bears the stamp of a plan. Rooms shift to accommodate. A settlement house that once served tea now hosts classes in typing taught by someone who still writes letters by hand. A church balcony becomes a rehearsal space because the ground floor belongs to a soup line. The library offers talks about making a budget with no wiggle, and the talks fill with men who would prefer to be outside with hammers and inside with books but are, for the afternoon, inside with numbers that refuse to lie. A poster appears in a shop window advertising a mural going up in a school. Children pass and peer in at sketches taped to a wall. The image is strange and familiar. Workers with broad shoulders, books with broad pages, trains crossing bridges that look stronger in chalk than they do in fact. Mutual aid formalizes what the block already knew how to do. A committee keeps envelopes labeled rent, coal, doctor, burial. The labels reflect the life of a street with its back against a wall. When a summons comes, the envelope goes to the hand that needs it and is later refilled by a dance or a basket set out in a shop. Names are written in a ledger with a care that looks like love, though the committee would refuse such a word because the work is not romantic and because love does not help with columns that must add. The committee is made of neighbors who do not call themselves leaders. They keep this preference even when newspapers call them something else for a day. The WPA brings instructors who are good at their craft and new to the neighborhood. There are teachers who move slowly through rooms examining hands and posture, who kneel beside a student to adjust the angle of a pencil or the tilt of a wrist beneath a brush. They know that their presence here has a politics larger than the class. They also know that a class is not a slogan.
It is a sequence. Mark, Erase, mark again. Keep the page clean. Do not waste paper. Breathe.
A girl who has not held a paintbrush before discovers the way water moves pigment and acts like weather on a page. A boy who has never seen a printing press watches type, lay down lines that will be read by 100 eyes. Some students will make work the city will hang. Others will make work their neighbors will admire on a refrigerator door. Both will have learned a practice that will not disappear when the program ends. Public performance bends to match harder budgets. Bands that once preened now tune quickly and play long because the door must be covered and the rent will not wait for a flourish. The Savoy's floor still bounces. The shoes are shined because pride pays dividends when money cannot. Couples dance with less flash and more stamina. The steps cleaner because the count is the point now, not the leap. Watching them, you can see the mathematics of morale. Repeating patterns produce confidence, and confidence produces the kind of endurance that can carry you through a week when none of the columns line up. Local theatres produce short plays that look like the neighbourhood, rooms drawn on canvas flats that have the right number of chairs, doors that stick a little when pulled with one hand, windows that make the audience nod in recognition. Scripts feature small victories, a woman who persuades a landlord to wait, a man who finds a coin under a stair that leads to a job, a child who reads a stubborn sentence aloud at last and claims it as his. The plays end without fanfare. The curtain falls the way a letter is folded and sealed. Audiences leave with the feeling that their very lives can be stories worth the cost of a ticket.
This feeling is not an extravagance.
It is a deposit in a bank of stamina. Magazines shrink and persist. The cost of ink is what it is.
Editors cut pages, not principles.
They still print poems about windows and stoops, about shoes, about the light under a door, about the sounds of a train in the lungs when a man has walked too far looking for work and must rest with his hands on his knees to catch breath. A librarian keeps back issues on a shelf marked with a handwritten card. The card is straight. The shelf is dusted. People continue to take volumes down to show visitors as if to say, "See, the city printed us, and therefore we continue." Such rituals look small in photographs. They are not small from the inside. Numbers continue to matter. The arithmetic of pooled coins keeps a young person in school for a term. The count of blankets in a church closet keeps men sleeping indoors rather than on stairs. The tally of members in a block association convinces the city to send someone to fix a light. A teacher's role shows two absent boys. She sends a second note home with a girl to ask whether a family has moved, and if so, where, and if not, why, and if they know there is a clinic on Tuesday. Counting is often spoken of as cold. Here it feels like heat distributed in careful lines. Without numbers, the warmth leaks away. There are cracks and nobody denies them.
Rents bite.
Tempers fray. A brawl at a corner shows how quickly a rumour can leap from mouth to fist. The rumour lies down eventually exhausted, but the bruise remains. Leaders gather to knock reassurances together like kindling. They ask for patience and get the look neighbours give to neighbours when the word patience feels like a coat one size too small. Some nights the police behave like the weather, unpredictable and without apology. People tighten themselves around their own like scarves against a sudden squall. They do not pretend storms are not storms. They go inside and wait together. When the season tilts toward another year, the block looks older, less for the wrinkles than for the habits. Rent parties have their own calendars now. Lectures about law are as familiar as the pages listing services and hours. Children recognize the WPA instructors on the street and wave with ownership rather than awe. The library's reading room looks like the city's memory, organized and welcoming and stubborn as a grandmother who refuses to move her chair for fashion. Small parlor salons continue, softer and more necessary than before, because they ask for no money and promise a return larger than applause. The return of attention paid in full. You find yourself measuring time differently. A day is as long as a list written without haste. A week is as long as a story read in chapters before sleep. A month is as long as the interval between visits to a neighbor who cannot leave the house this winter and will therefore benefit from fresh bread and a voice that names the weather. The depression has not made you saintly.
It has made you deliberate.
The city meets deliberation with a politics of its own. New committees form, some in rooms with flags, some in rooms with a picture of a baby on a mantle. They share a project to hold the center, not because it is fashionable, but because it is functional. Through it all, music insists. A horn finds a way to make a small hall feel ample. A drum insists on counting the city's steps as if it could keep wobble from breaking stride. Dancers keep their tickets priced as low as arithmetic allows. The floor squeaks, yes, but it also answers with a spring when the whole room turns together on a beat, learned from the trains and the breath and the metronomes of the salons. On a good night, you can stand at the edge and witness the thing you have been living. A culture showing its core strength by choosing repetition over spectacle, clarity over drama, and neighborliness over noise. What remains unclear, as the third winter approaches, is which parts of this adaptation will last beyond need. Will the committees dissolve when the envelopes are full again? Will the plays grow more ornate and forget the rooms that raised their curtains? Will the reading lists return to travel books and romances, leaving the law pamphlets to yellow? Or will the neighborhood keep a portion of its severity as a style, the way a seamstress keeps a favorite stitch, even when silk returns to the cutting table? At some point quietly, people begin to go. Not all at once and not with fanfare. A cousin finds work in another city and writes back to say the blocks there echo familiar names. A brother follows a rumor to a factory that needs hands more than it needs questions. A family that arrived years ago 2 steps from empty now leaves with their furniture strapped to a truck that looks stronger than the crates that carried them north. The block feels the change not in absence, which is always present in a city, but in a softness around the edges, like a sweater that has been washed too often. Corners talk about departures without judgment. It would be vain to call leaving a failure when staying could be just as easily named stubbornness. The neighborhood has learned not to place narrative where arithmetic rules. When a new decade approaches, a group of men and women meet in a room with a long table to discuss whether to organize an anniversary of sorts, not of a movement, because movements are difficult to place on calendars, but of a library, a club, a block association. Their debate is simple and generous. They want to mark not achievement, but endurance. They choose a small program, a reading, a choir, a dance for children, a speech about nothing more than the way the corner looked 10 years earlier and the way it looks now. The speech is careful not to lie. It notes losses, the shop that closed, the man who moved, the rent that rose. It notes gains, the light that was fixed, the bench that was replaced, the child who learned to read and then taught others. People leave the event with the sense that the story told belongs to them not because it flatters them, but because it has been kept on good paper in a fair hand. If you are tempted, now at the end, to ask what remains of what the world called the Harlem Renaissance, when the world moved on to other labels and other neighborhoods, you may think about the following ledger, written not in columns but in rooms. What remains is the habit of starting on time because people have little time. What remains is the idea that a poem can live inside a city's ordinary breath and still do work. What remains is the practice of reading in company and of speaking without shouting, and of helping without announcing, and of counting without humiliating. What remains is the elegant mundanity of a culture that chose the tools at hand, chair, cup, list, pencil, drum, book, and used them to make dignity available at a price a block could afford. And in the echo that follows the last paragraph of this long story, when the library lights go out and the presses rest and the band packs its instruments and the teachers collect their chalk and the hostess folds her curtain and the porter sets his hat on a peg by the door, there is one last quiet question that floats like dust in winter sunlight. In a century that keeps reintroducing hardship with different names, which of these unglamorous habits, those learned in kitchens, on stoops, in library chairs, in parlor circles, will prove themselves again as the right size for living? And who among us will recognize them quickly enough to lift them from the shelf and put them back to work?